The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under the weight of a brassy, unforgiving sun. For Arthur Blackwood, the silence of his homestead was a physical presence, a thick blanket woven from dust and grief. It had settled over him the day he buried Cora, and it had not lifted in the 2 years since. His farm, once a testament to hope carved from the wild prairie, was now an echo of his own hollowed-out spirit. Fences sagged like weary shoulders, and the fields lay fallow, choked with the stubborn weeds that thrived on neglect. Each day was a ritual of diminishment. Arthur moved through the motions of survival, his actions stripped of purpose. He milked his one remaining cow, its lowing a lonely question in the vast emptiness. He tended a small garden, just enough to sustain a life he no longer felt was his own. The house itself, built with his own hands for a future that had turned to ash, was a museum of loss. Cora's rocking chair sat by the cold hearth, a silent sentinel guarding a ghost. The small cradle he had sanded to a perfect smoothness was tucked away in the loft, a wound he could not bear to look upon. Grief was not a sharp pain anymore. It was the soil under his feet, the air in his lungs. It had weight and texture. It was the grit in the bread he baked from his dwindling flour and the taste of the water he drew from the well. He spoke to no one for weeks at a time, the sound of his own voice becoming a stranger's when he had to soothe the cow or curse at a stubborn root. The nearest settlement was a half-day's ride, and he had long since ceased making the journey. The pitying glances and clumsy condolences of the townsfolk were harder to bear than the solitude. They saw a man broken by tragedy. They could not see the architecture of his sorrow, the way it had rebuilt him from the inside out into something hard and inaccessible. He was hauling water from the well, the rope biting into his calloused hands, when he first saw the figure. It was a shimmer in the heat haze at the edge of his property, a disturbance in the monotonous landscape. He paused, muscles tensed. Strangers were rarely a blessing. He watched as the figure stumbled, fell to one knee, and then pushed itself back up with a visible, gut-wrenching effort. It was not a rider, and it was not a man walking with purpose. It was someone at the very end of their strength. Arthur set the bucket down, his hand moving instinctively toward the axe handle leaning against the well. He was not a man who sought trouble, but he had learned that trouble often came uninvited. As the figure drew closer, staggering through the tall, dry grass, the details sharpened. It was a native man, old and frail, his face a mask of deep lines and exhaustion. His clothes were worn, and he carried no weapon that Arthur could see, only a deep and abiding weariness that seemed to pull him toward the earth. He was dying. It was not a guess, it was a certainty, as clear as the merciless blue of the sky. The man's eyes, when they finally lifted to meet Arthur's, held no fear, only a profound and final dignity. The man collapsed not 20 yards from the cabin door, a quiet surrender to gravity. Arthur stood frozen for a long moment, the silence rushing back in, now filled with a new and pressing tension. A part of him, the hard, calloused part that had grown over his heart like a scar, wanted to turn away. To walk back inside, bar the door, and let the prairie claim what it would. It was the law of this land, wasn't it? The weak perished. He had learned that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. But another part of him, a voice he thought had died with Cora, whispered a dissent. It was the voice that remembered her kindness, her belief that even in a harsh world, a man's worth was measured by his compassion. He saw not an Indian, not a threat, but a fellow creature at the precipice of death. With a sigh that felt like it tore something loose inside him, Arthur let the axe handle go. He walked slowly toward the fallen man, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. He knelt. The man's breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His skin was hot and dry to the touch. Arthur's hands, clumsy from disuse in any gentle task, moved to check for wounds. He found an old, poorly healed injury on the man's side, inflamed and angry, but it was the fever and the profound exhaustion that were killing him. Without a word, Arthur slid his arms under the man's thin frame. He was lighter than a sack of feed. The effort of lifting him was nothing compared to the weight of the decision he had just made. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. Arthur laid the old man on his own cot, the only bed in the house. The man's eyes flickered open, dark and surprisingly lucid. They swept the small, sparse room, taking in the clean-swept floor, the neatly stacked firewood, the empty rocking chair. They were not the eyes of a beggar. They were the eyes of a king surveying a foreign land. Arthur worked with a grim, functional efficiency. He fetched a basin of cool water and a clean rag, wiping the grime and sweat from the man's face. He spooned a little water between the dry, cracked lips. The man drank, a flicker of gratitude in his gaze. For the rest of the afternoon, they existed in a shared silence, broken only by the sound of the man's labored breathing and the quiet movements of Arthur tending to him. As dusk bruised the sky into shades of purple and orange, Arthur took stock of his larder. There was a heel of dry bread, a few potatoes, and the last of a thin rabbit stew he had made days ago. It was meant to be his meal for tonight and the next day. It was, quite literally, all he had. He looked at the man on the cot, a stranger who had brought an unwelcome complication to his ordered misery. Then he looked at the stew. He thought of Cora, who had never once turned away a hungry traveler, who believed that sharing a meal was a sacred thing. He built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel both smaller and less empty. He reheated the stew, the meager aroma filling the room. He propped the old man up, supporting his back with his own body. He held the spoon to the man's lips, feeding him as one would a child. The man ate slowly, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He was not just consuming food, he was consuming the nature of his host. He was tasting the sacrifice, the reluctance, the deeply buried kernel of goodness that had prompted the act. When the stew was gone, Arthur broke the bread in two and gave the larger piece to his guest. After the meal, a measure of strength seemed to return to the old man. He gestured for more water, and when Arthur held the cup for him, he spoke for the first time. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across hard ground, and he spoke in a mix of Lakota and fractured English. "I am Tashunka," he said, the name spoken with a quiet pride that defied his condition. He was a chief. Arthur felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. This was not some lone wanderer. This was a man of importance, a man whose absence would be noted. "You are, good spirit," Tashunka continued, his gaze intense. "The grief, Walker, but your heart is not stone." He saw it. He saw the sorrow that clung to Arthur like a shroud. Arthur said nothing, merely nodding. There was no defense against a truth so plainly seen. Over the next 2 days, a strange peace settled in the cabin. Arthur tended to the chief, and Tashunka, in his moments of clarity, talked. He spoke of his people, of the shrinking lands and the fading buffalo. He spoke of a world that was vanishing before his eyes, and most of all he spoke of his daughters, 5 of them. He spoke their names like a prayer: Winona, Istas, Wachiwi, Zitkala, Mina. He described their strengths, their fears, his deep and abiding love for them. He was not just a chief losing his world, he was a father terrified for the future of his children. Listening to Tashunka, Arthur felt an unfamiliar stirring. The chief's grief was vast and communal, the sorrow of a whole people. His own felt small and selfish in comparison. But the core of it, the fear of a father for his children, was a language Arthur understood. It resonated with the silent, aching space in the loft where the cradle sat. He found himself speaking of Cora, of the boy they never got to name. The words came out rusty and stiff, but they came. In the presence of a dying man, Arthur Blackwood began to speak of the dead. On the morning of the 3rd day, the air in the cabin was different. It was still, expectant. Tashunka's breathing was quieter, smoother. Arthur approached the cot and saw that the fever had broken. The chief's eyes were clear, and a faint, serene smile touched his lips. He knew, and Arthur knew. "You shared your last meal," Tashunka whispered, his voice faint but clear. "A man who shares his last morsel with an enemy is no man's enemy. He is a protector." He reached out a trembling hand and grasped Arthur's arm. The grip was surprisingly firm. "My daughters, they will need a protector. In the path of the coming storm, a strong tree is needed." He gave Arthur directions, describing a landmarker trio of hawk-shaped rocks and a trail. He told him that he had instructed his eldest, Winona, that if he did not return from his vision quest within 10 days, she was to lead her sisters to the land of the Griefwalker, the man who lived by the silent creek. "A debt of honor," Tashunka breathed, his eyes closing. "Life for life, sanctuary for kindness." His hand went slack. His last breath was not a rattle or a gasp, but a gentle sigh, a release. The silence that followed was different from the one that had lived in the cabin before. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of a great man's passing and the burden of his final words. Arthur sat by the cot for a long time as the sun climbed the sky. He had invited a dying man in for his final moments. He had not expected to inherit his legacy. He buried Chief Tashunka on a small hill overlooking the creek, a place Cora had loved. He wrapped the body in his cleanest spare blanket and fashioned a marker from 2 sturdy branches bound with twine. It was a simple, respectful act. As he shoveled the last of the earth onto the mound, he felt a profound shift within him. The stasis had been broken. He was no longer just a man waiting to die. He was a man waiting for the arrival of 5 strangers, the daughters of a chief. He was the Griefwalker who had been named a protector. For a week he waited. The silence of the farm returned, but it was now a listening silence. Arthur found himself working with a renewed, if anxious, purpose. He mended the section of fence that had bothered him for months. He cleared a new patch for planting, his muscles protesting the unaccustomed labor. He was preparing for what he did not fully know. An invasion, a delegation, a misunderstanding that could get him killed. He cleaned the cabin, aired out Cora's things, and brought the cradle down from the loft, placing it near the hearth. It was not a conscious decision, but an instinct. He was making space. They arrived on the 8th day after Tashunka's death, just as the sun was beginning its descent. He saw them first as a small, tight group on the horizon, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of long travel. 5 women. As they drew closer, he could see they were leading 2 pack ponies laden with bundles. They stopped at the edge of his cleared land, just as their father had. The one in the lead, who could only be Winona, dismounted. She was tall and slender, with a bearing that mirrored her father's dignity. Her face was a study in controlled sorrow, her eyes holding the deep, quiet pain of a fresh loss. The other 4 women remained with the horses, their faces watchful, a mixture of fear, grief, and fierce loyalty. Arthur walked out to meet them, his hands open at his sides. He stopped a respectful distance away. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass, the only sound between them. "I am Winona," she said, her voice clear and steady, though laced with an undeniable strain. "Daughter of Tashunka." "I am Arthur Blackwood," he replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "Your father, he is at peace. I buried him on that hill." He gestured with his chin toward the grave. Winona's gaze followed his, and for a moment the mask of control wavered. A profound sadness washed over her features before she mastered it again. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "He told us that if he did not return, we were to come here. He said we would find a man of honor, a protector." Her words hung in the air, a heavier burden than Arthur could have imagined. This was not a negotiation. It was the fulfillment of a promise he had never explicitly made. He looked past her to the other sisters. Istas, whose eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. Wachiwi, who seemed younger, her fear more visible on her face. Zitkala, who held herself with a warrior's posture, her hand resting near a knife at her belt. And Mina, the youngest, who clung to the side of one of the ponies, her large, dark eyes fixed on him with a child's unfiltered apprehension. "He called this a debt of honor," Winona continued, her eyes searching his face, looking for the man her father had described. "We do not come as beggars. We have skills. We know this land. We can hunt, forage, heal. We will work. We ask only for sanctuary, a place to live without fear, under the protection your kindness to our father has earned." It was a speech of incredible courage and desperation. They were offering themselves not as a dowry in the way his people would understand it, but as partners in a pact for survival. They were a family, displaced and vulnerable, seeking shelter from the storm their father had foreseen. Arthur thought of the settlement, of men like Garrett Vance, a rancher whose land bordered his own to the east. Vance was a man who saw the world in terms of possessions and power. He would not see 5 grieving women seeking sanctuary. He would see property to be claimed, or a threat to be eradicated. To take them in was to invite a war he was not sure he could win. To turn them away was to betray the memory of the chief he had fed and sheltered. It was to become the man he was before, the man made of stone. "Your father was a great man," Arthur said, the words feeling inadequate. "You are welcome here. There isn't much, but what I have is yours." Relief, so profound it was almost like a collapse, washed over Winona's face. Behind her, the shoulders of her sisters seemed to sag with it. The decision was made. The door to Arthur's quiet, grieving world had been thrown wide open, and a new, complicated, and dangerous future had just walked in. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of observation and accommodation. The sisters moved into the barn, refusing his offer of the cabin. They created their own space with a quiet, swift efficiency that amazed him, turning the dusty, hay-strewn interior into a clean, ordered dwelling. They communicated amongst themselves in the soft, flowing cadences of their own tongue, their voices a constant, low murmur that filled the silence Arthur had grown so accustomed to. They kept their word. From the first day they worked. Istas, it turned out, was a genius with plants. She walked the land with Arthur, pointing out roots and leaves he had always dismissed as weeds, explaining their uses for food and medicine. Within a week, she had revived his failing garden and started a new one, her hands seeming to coax life from the tired soil. Zitkala was the hunter and guardian. She moved through the surrounding woods with a silence that was unnerving, returning with rabbits or fowl, her presence a silent warning to any predators, 2-legged or 4. Wachiwi and Mina took over the domestic chores with a gentle competence. They mended Arthur's worn clothes, organized his chaotic larder, and cooked meals that were flavorful and nourishing, using ingredients foraged from the land. They brought an order and a warmth to the cabin that it had not known since Cora's time, and Winona was the leader, the fulcrum around which her sisters pivoted. She directed their efforts, acted as their spokeswoman, and was the one who dealt most directly with Arthur. Their interactions were formal, respectful, and freighted with unspoken things. Arthur would share his knowledge of farming, of crop rotation and irrigation from the creek, and Winona would listen, her intelligent eyes absorbing everything. In return, she would teach him about the rhythms of the prairie, the signs of changing weather in the behavior of insects, the ways of the animals. They were 2 teachers and 2 students from different worlds, finding common ground in the soil beneath their feet. Slowly, tentatively, the ice of Arthur's grief began to thaw. He found himself looking forward to the shared meals, no longer eaten in silence but filled with the sisters' quiet talk. He learned their individual personalities, Istas's dry, unexpected wit, Zitkala's fierce, protective loyalty, Wachiwi's artistic spirit, which she expressed by weaving intricate patterns into baskets and mats, Mina's shy smile, which slowly began to appear more often. And Winona. He found himself watching her most of all. He saw the immense burden she carried as the head of her family, the grief for her father that she held so tightly in check. He saw her strength, but he also saw glimpses of her vulnerability in the quiet moments when she thought no one was looking, when she would stand on the hill by her father's grave. A connection grew between them, unspoken and undefined. It was a bond forged in shared loss and a mutual growing respect. He saw her not as an Indian, not as a woman, but as a person of profound depth and integrity. And in her eyes, he began to feel he was no longer just the grief walker, but Arthur again. The farm began to breathe again. The fields were cleared and planted. The fences were mended and strong. The scent of cooking food and wood smoke once again meant home, not just survival. The change was palpable, a resurrection. But Arthur knew it was a fragile peace. The world did not stop at the borders of his land. The confrontation he had dreaded came in the form of Garrett Vance. Vance was a big man with a florid face and small, acquisitive eyes. He rode onto Arthur's property one afternoon with two of his hired hands, his expression a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He had clearly heard the rumors that had been festering in the settlement. "Blackwood," Vance boomed, his voice too loud for the quiet afternoon. He let his gaze sweep over the transformed farm, lingering on Wachiwi and Mina, who were tending the garden near the cabin. They immediately froze, their faces becoming still and guarded. Arthur walked out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He positioned himself between Vance and the women. "Vance," he said, his voice level. "Heard you've taken in some strays," Vance said, a cruel smirk on his lips. "Figured I'd come see for myself. You running a mission now?" His men snickered. His eyes were not on Arthur, but on the women, a blatant, appraising stare that made Arthur's blood run cold. "They're under my protection," Arthur stated simply. The words felt solid, real. He was no longer just saying them, he was living them. Just then, Winona and Zitkala emerged from the woods, returning from a hunt. Zitkala carried a brace of rabbits, and a bow was slung over her shoulder. They stopped short when they saw the riders, and Zitkala's hand went to the knife at her belt. Winona's face was unreadable, but she moved to stand with her younger sisters, her presence a shield. Vance's eyes lit up with a dangerous combination of lust and avarice. "Protection, or have you just bought yourself a whole stable of squaws?" He sneered. "Whatever you paid, I'll double it. A man gets lonely out here. Be a shame for them to go to waste on a sad case like you." Rage, clean and hot and utterly unfamiliar, surged through Arthur. It burned away the last vestiges of his apathy. This man was not just insulting him, he was defiling the memory of a chief, threatening a family, and desecrating the sanctuary he had promised to provide. "They are not for sale," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly quiet. "They are my family. This is their home, and you will get off my land, now." Vance was taken aback by the venom in Arthur's tone. He had known Arthur as the broken farmer, the man who had retreated from the world. This was someone else entirely. But his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. "Your family," he scoffed. "Don't be a fool, Blackwood. You know what these people are. This is an unnatural arrangement. The folks in town won't stand for it. They'll see you as a traitor to your own kind." "Then let them," Arthur said, taking a step forward. "My kind are the ones who honor their word. My kind are the ones who protect those in need." "I don't know what kind you are, Vance, but you are not welcome here." It was Winona who spoke next, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. She stepped forward, standing beside Arthur. She did not look at Vance, but at his hired hands, her gaze withering. "We are the daughters of Tashunka," she said, her English clear and precise. "We are not property. This man, Arthur Blackwood, is a man of honor. You are not. Your presence dishonors the ground where our father rests. Leave." The sheer force of her dignity, combined with Arthur's unyielding stance, shifted the balance. Vance's men shuffled their horses, suddenly uneasy. This was not the easy intimidation they had expected. Vance looked from Arthur's cold fury to Winona's imperious command, and he saw a united front he could not easily break. He was a bully, not a warrior. With a final venomous glare, he wrenched his horse's reins. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat. "You've made a powerful enemy today." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like jackals. Silence descended again, but it was a triumphant silence. Arthur's heart was hammering in his chest, his hands clenched into fists. He slowly turned to look at Winona. Her face was still impassive, but her eyes held a new light. It was a look of profound, unwavering respect. In that moment, the pact of survival was sealed in blood and fire, transformed into a bond of true alliance. The five sisters were no longer guests under his protection, and he was no longer their benefactor. They were, as he had said, a family. In the months that followed, life on the farm settled into a new equilibrium. The threat from Vance lingered, a shadow at the edge of their lives, but he did not return. The story of his humiliation at the hands of the grieving farmer and the chief's proud daughter had made the rounds, and for now it kept him at bay. The farm flourished as it never had before, a vibrant oasis of cooperation. It was a place where two cultures met and wove themselves together, creating something new and resilient. The cradle by the hearth was no longer a symbol of what was lost. Mina and Wachiwi would sometimes place their dolls in it, their quiet play a gentle exorcism of the sorrow that had clung to the object. The house was filled with the scents of baking bread and strange, delicious herbs. The fields were green with promise. The unspoken connection between Arthur and Winona deepened, growing in the quiet spaces between words. They would often work together in the evenings, mending tools or planning the next season's planting. They spoke of their pasts, of the people they had loved and lost. He told her more about Cora, about the bright, hopeful future they had planned. She told him of her mother, a wise woman who had taught her the responsibilities of leadership. They found solace in each other's stories, a shared understanding of grief's heavy weight. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, he finally spoke the thought that had been growing in his heart. "I think your father would be proud," Arthur said softly. "Of all of you, you've built a home here." Winona turned to him, her expression soft in the fading light. "He would be proud of you, Arthur Blackwood," she replied. "He saw the man you were, beneath the pain. You honored him, you honored us." She reached out and, for the first time, placed her hand over his on the arm of the chair. Her touch was warm, and it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated life through him. It was a feeling he thought he would never experience again. He looked out over his land, at the sturdy fences and the promising fields. He saw Istas and Zitkala walking back from the creek, their laughter carrying on the evening air. He saw the light glowing from the windows of the barn, a beacon of life. The crushing silence he had lived with for so long was a distant memory. His grief for Cora and his son would always be a part of him, a quiet room in the house of his heart, but it was no longer the whole house. Tashunka had come to his farm to die, but in doing so, he had brought Arthur back to life. He had arrived a man entombed by his past, a grief walker lost in a wasteland of his own making. Now, surrounded by this unexpected, fierce and wonderful family, under the watchful eyes of the woman who saw him for who he truly was, he had found his way home. The prairie was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning.